Good evening and welcome back to My Character's Design. So if you're just joining me, this is the second in a two-part series on vector illustration for some fan art for the Studio Ghibli film Nausicaa of the Valley of the Winds. And today I'll be coloring in the baby Ohm I started in the first part of the series. Now if you're watching on screen, you'll see that I've selected the outline that I finished over and mirrored in the previous section, and now what I'm doing is deciding on a color palette. Now I've already have an image in mind for the color palette from the actual movie, so I know I'm going for like a blue-green, a teal spectrum. What I like to use here is Adobe's color tool. It used to be called Cooler, but now it's just color.adobe.com, and you'll see that link on the screen. And this is an awesome resource in that it links right up to your Adobe Cloud system. So if you select and save out one of these palettes, you can go ahead and create your own, but there's plenty to choose from. You can take that palette to Photoshop, InDesign, and Illustrator seamlessly, and then add it to an existing AIE or ASE file. So make it larger, part of a larger starting palette, which is what I intend to do here. And you can see I've chosen this palette here, and I like it because it does have the teal. It also has that contrast color of the bright pink in case I wanted to make the Ohm eyes, like how the Ohms get angry. But in this case, we're just going to stay with the nice peaceful Ohm after it's been calmed by Nausicaa's song. And you can see here I've pulled up the library as well as my custom palette. Now you can't actually take that library stuff to the custom palette directly. What you have to do is put it into your swatches panel, which makes sense actually. But the problem is I didn't have all of my custom colors loaded into the swatches as well. So you'll see I'm kind of struggling here. What I ended up doing is actually just deleting everything in the swatches palette, then moving it over, and then saving over the original custom palette. And that's great because every time you do this, if you work on a new project every time, you can grow your palette naturally. And you'll see there's a lot of the standard colors that are actually already in the Illustrator palette in there. Because they've got some decent reds and blues and all that, all the standard stuff you need. I actually do like their earth tones. Their muted earth tones is not bad. So struggle, finally get it. Looks like I'm going to go ahead and ditch everything. And there we go. We're going to drop all of that into the swatches panel, and then we're going to save that out. And then just so you guys are aware, that's the little hamburger button on the right-hand side, and you can save it as an AI or an ASE. The difference is that one can save gradients and patterns, the other can't. And I believe the AI is just used primarily for AI, and it's the more stringent of the two, but it does give you the gradients, and the ASE is not. So what I'm doing here is applying the color to one of the first shapes, and the trick here is to select one of your outline shapes, reverse the colors using Shift-X, and then select the color that you want the object to be. And that way you've removed the outline at the same time. And it's easier actually to select a solid colored object, because I don't know if you guys are aware of this, an outline object must be selected by the outline. A solid object can be selected by the outline or by the solid fill. And so if it's, as long as it's not like underneath any other object, is much easier. And I'm going to go through this, and I'm going to go ahead and continue just selecting out the shapes that I want to make part of the shell of the Ohm, the colorful part of the shell. You'll see this dark blue, almost black color is going to be the outline here. And this is kind of a standard, like, very, I'd say, coloring book, almost comic book or cartoon style, where you have the fat outer lines and those thinner, not terribly thin, but thinner inner lines. And the idea behind that, obviously, is you're creating a better separation between the background and the character. You're giving it more weight. It has a better silhouette. There's a bunch of reasons to do it. It tends to just look better, and it's something that I've learned over tons and tons of drawings and feedback from mentors, is that if you give it that thick outline, people tend to recognize it as something more graphic than if you were just draw the whole thing under one line quality. And again, that's something that I can't stress enough, is that when you're doing these Illustrator projects, is you can certainly go ahead and use like the same width of line the whole way, but you really have to try to build in that line quality as you work on the thing. So having lines that get fatter and thinner and fatter and thinner and have varying shapes, have an arc, have a subtle curve, have some irregularities is very important. It creates a more dynamic, a more organic look. It drives visual interest, because otherwise it's just a bunch of really crudely built shapes, or can be if you don't do this right. Now, a lot of the elements that we see here on screen actually are probably not going to make it into the final illustration. And the reason for that is because they were mirrored, and so they're actually incorrect for the lighting source. So you see, as I continue going through this, I'm going to go ahead and drop out some of the shadows, especially on the right-hand side. I think everything on the left-hand side is pretty good, but also on the right-hand side is preliminary. And I've got to make a lot of these. Not all of these are just going to be selections. Some of this is going to be selections. I'm going to have to draw some of this stuff as I go, because a lot of these light sources weren't complete when I was doing the outline. And they only became complete once I did the color and could better see where it needed variation. With these vector illustrations, you don't necessarily pop in everything there. And you can see how I'm bringing a shape that's behind all the way to the front using the Shift command, close bracket, square bracket, that is. So I've skipped ahead a little bit here. And you can see I'm still kind of working my way through. And what I'm doing here is applying a gradient. And so when you apply a gradient, you can open the gradient tool by pressing G. And what that does is it allows you to actually control on the actual illustration board where the gradient comes from, versus just using the gradient tool on the tool panel on the right hand side, because that can be a little bit constraining if you're just having to type in all the factors. So, and as you're going here, obviously, if we're looking for a consistent light source, you're going to be making sure those are all the same. The light's coming from the same side. So the lighter teal's on the top right, the darker teal's on the bottom left, and there's not a huge difference. It should be almost optically invisible. Gradients are something that can look really impressive, but they stink of like amateur illustrator / designer. And then we look here, and I'm really going in here and carefully marking these shadows. So this is the front of the Ohm. It's the most focal part of his whole character. These little pedipads, and if the shadows on here are messed up, it's gonna really mess up the rest of the illustration, because it's essentially the character's face. It doesn't have eyes. It's not expressive. So you have to create these in a way that are going to drive visual interest and sell the creature better. So you can see we're really looking at following the contours we've already built into the outline shape, as well as the shell shape, and then really trying to tweak those so that you can see that there's some form there suggested by the shadows that just won't come through on a flat shape. Now, at this point, I believe each of the pedipads is on its own layer. And the reason I did that is, again, for eventual animation, but it becomes a real lifesaver here. And for those of you who don't know, Illustrator will default to drawing on the layer you just selected an item on. So for example, if you select a main part of the main body, which is, you can see the outline in red, then it will default to drawing on that layer, unless you've locked it. And so you can see here I had to select the pedipad on the right hand side in order to draw on that object's layer. Another way to get around that would be to obviously lock everything else you're not working on. But I find in my workflow it's quick enough to address as I'm going and do it organically. So I don't usually tinker with it too much. And these shadows here on the right hand side are going to be less, they're going to be smaller obviously as they get closer to the light source. Now, is this really how the shadows will look? No, it's a design decision. And the reason for having a break on the left-hand side is that we're assuming a cast shadow from the other, like it's not a cast shadow, we're assuming another shadow on the left-hand side of the creature. So in nature, usually things aren't lit from one side directly unless you're like in a very dark room, there's just one light source. Things are lit directly from one side and then indirectly from the left side with a bounce light perhaps, or a light that creeps around the form of the creature. So if it's got rounded shapes, you're going to have some light that creeps around on both sides. And so by doing this shadow that doesn't completely hit both sides, we're telling the viewer this is a round shape and there's light coming from the behind or the underside of it. All right, and then just finishing up some of those shapes. And then those are just set to a multiply layer in the appearance panel. Once you've done one, all you have to do is eyedropper another one to tell Illustrator, hey, I want the same appearance. So opacity, I believe I'm working at like 20%. It's a near black, just like the outline of the Ohm. And just putting on a multiply continues that hue of that teal the whole way through. Now, this is where I talked about how I had to go in and build these shadows, not in the outlining portion, but actually in the color portion. And the reason for that is it really, I needed to find what the overall look of it was and if it needed it. And in this case, it certainly did. I think that it was way too flat. And these details are going to help create that sellability. This is a organic creature. And it's got bumpy, rough carapace, not some smooth shell. These are really finicky, obviously you're going in and you have to add a shadow under every one of these eyes. And then you have to cut out these highlight shapes here. And the thing with both the Pathfinder tool and the Shape Builder tool is they are kind of dependent on which object's on top. And they'll behave badly if you're not conforming to kind of its unwritten rule. So I find it's best, even though the Shape Builder tool should work in a way where you don't need to make a bunch of throwaway shapes, to just copy and paste that shape up front, and that way you don't have to worry about throwaways or anything like that. And then this is a good technique for saving time. Instead of drawing a highlight in every one of these, what you use is just go ahead and go in there and use the offset path tool, cut out what you don't need, and then round those edges. So you get a really good look. You get actually a pretty solid highlight for minimal work, but it feels right because it's consistent the whole way through. And as long as you're not varying too wildly in the way you do the other highlights, your viewer is not gonna ding you for it. And this is something kind of new. This is something I usually don't do, is use the brush tool. I've always found it to be kind of, just lame, and your natural tendency is to use it like a Photoshop brush. But in this case, we're looking for these really specific kind of ovular highlights. And drawing with the brush tool, and then going in afterwards, and you can use it by just pressing B, and going in afterwards and literally just like tweaking a little bit in their stroke width, or their position, or their general size, really saved a lot of time here. And since this is a hand-drawn thing, that we're mocking, that we're mimicking, that we're making an homage to, we're having this hand-drawn look really helps. Now, I do have a few custom brushes built in Illustrator for doing a hand-drawn look. It's really easy actually just scan ink blots and ink stripes and, painting with Sumi ink or doing some watercolors and then popping it in Illustrator's Life Trace and making a brush. But in this case, I didn't want quite that much texture. I was trying to get a very clean look with the highlights. And I think this really was successful here on the outside of the carapace, where we're getting these nice white stripes that feel very, I don't know, they feel very anime or cartoony to me. I just like what happened, and I certainly wouldn't have put them in there if I didn't think they had some merit. And in other artwork, you'll see a highlight will be shown as like a large kind of blob with maybe it's a gradient that tends to feather at the end with an opacity. And that could work really well too here. You could do like large areas of highlight. But I just have this feel is these tighter highlights kind of sell that more specular look. As if maybe the carapace is wet, or, you know, it's like a bug carapace and that it's kind of a shiny material like a plastic or, you know, a metal or a bug's, you know, a bug's exoskeleton. So we're going through there, and if you're wondering why those lines are showing up as a kind of a bizarre teal fill first, is because we've selected the object behind them, the carapace shell, and so the lines inherit the last thing they touch essentially when you're drawing them. So they inherit that gradient color that's applied to those, which isn't ideal, but you know, it's just one of those things. Okay, so skipping ahead, we're looking at some of the finer details. You can see we've swapped the shadows on the eyes, and now what we're doing is we're going to be adding ellipses. And these ellipses are just like the other highlights here. They're a screen of a light turquoise. You can see it on the bottommost one of my swatches. And I'm adding these rounds. What they're doing is they're giving an organic look to the creature, as if there's a bumpy texture to it, without doing a ton of work, like having to actually, you know, create the rounded shadow on the bottom and the highlight on the top. We're really just doing a quickie way that'll be more graphic, and ultimately I think sells really well once you apply it in a few areas. And then part of doing that too is just making sure that you're using grouping methodology here. You know, you're using grouping in design. Is that bumps shouldn't appear by themselves. They should be in groups of 2 or 3, and they shouldn't be loners or stragglers. They should have you know, if you're going to do 16 bumps, you should have like 4 groups of 4 or 5 groups of 3 or something like that. And there shouldn't be a ton that live off on their own. There's maybe an odd one. And then what I do here is I kind of just take the work I did on other bump groups and I apply them in other places and kind of scale and shrink and swap and stuff like that. And what that does is it also helps you build that kind of repetitiveness. So the idea is that you're selling is you keep selling it over and over and over again, just in different scales. So it saves you work, saves you time, but also the reader goes, okay, that's a shape that belongs to this creature because I've seen it elsewhere. You know, nothing feels like that's weird, it's out of place, that's not what this thing would look like. No, because you're doing it in multiple places and it is what it would look like. So as it stands, I'm pretty much done on the carapace. Believe it or not, there's going to do a background here, and we're going to just do a neutral gray, and I think there's a tiny gradient on it, but maybe not. And then we're using our artboard tool. We're going to make this nice and square, and there's multiple reasons for that. If we're going to do a sticker, this is a fairly square sticker, that's great. And Redbubble is the company I print with. They like nice round or square things. You get more print space for that. Also, if you guys aren't aware, Instagram is a 1x1 format. So when you make a square, image, you actually are setting yourself up for success when you upload it to Instagram or, social networking. Facebook doesn't care if it's 1-to-1; it likes it just fine. Instagram, that's its preferred format. Twitter doesn't mind the 1-to-1 either. The only one that I know of that really has a problem with it is actually Pinterest. But Pinterest likes really long images. So like, what I'm thinking of, illustrated infographics are perfect for Pinterest. And so that's where you want to make those work. And then what we're working on is we're working on a back layer. And this is going to be the anchors that, and I forget the name of the enemy city at this point, but the enemy country nail into the ohms in order to gather all the creatures and, to bait them into attacking. So So those are actually nice hard shapes, and so we wanted to be as really exact with what we're doing here is try not to involve too many of those ellipse shapes that create the buff rough texture. And this we're looking for kind of a nice chromy look. I think mine's closer to like a plastic, honestly. But the way you do that is you have a nice low light, you have a nice highlight, and the specular highlight is really distinct. It only happens in one area. So imagine you have two light sources. You have a big white light source like maybe the moon, and then a secondary light source maybe like a light from a ship or something like that. And those light sources are playing across the surface. And you can see I'm using that old brush tool again, trying to go in there and lay those out. Just trying to get that perfect, because you're going to have to do it the whole way through. And quite honestly, with some of these, it might be easier just to use an ellipse or like even a rectangle with rounded edges. But ultimately, I get something that I can live with. And again, it's that idea of repetition. If you've done it once, do it again. And that way someone says, oh, that belongs in this illustration. It's not foreign to this character or this world. It's something that's inherent to how it works. And then we're outlining it with the same color we outlined the ohm in. And that way, the whole thing is one distinct object. It has one silhouette. We're not giving it a different outline color. Now, you could do that, but really, what are you going to outline a dark gray anchor in? Probably a black or a dark gray. So we're already there. Let's just go ahead and continue on. And I fill in the other two anchors. I don't really need to show you that because I feel like those are kind of, they speak for themselves. I mean, one's just kind of one with two bracket ends and the other one's a square one. And they are slightly different colors. And one is in the foreground on its own layer instead of in the background. So I'm going to copy those over, do some extensions and pulling those anchors out so I can make it a little bit longer. So this is some variance there. So we're keeping the same basic shape, the same rounding of corners, all the things that communicate to the viewer. This is the same object as the other side, but just a little bit longer. But we're going to go ahead and reverse a few things. We're reversing the specular light source, reversing the shadow. And the reason for that, of course, is it's on the right side of the ohm. So it's getting more light and less shadow. And you can see these little ellipse bumps I'm turning into the outline of the anchor. And those are just to show like a place where that carapace is bubbling up because it's being pierced by that anchor. Now looking at the whole thing from afar, looking at my test image and a bunch of other test images that kind of say, okay, what else is there about this ohm that makes sense? And then we know if you've seen Nausicaa, is that the ohms are either enraged and their eyes are red, or when Nausicaa sings the song, they are peaceful and they have these little tendrils that come out that are like healing tendrils, I believe. So we're going to go ahead and do those because I feel like that works really well. We're not going to get too fancy. We're going to just use the pen tool to draw out some nice curvy strokes. They'll all be on the same layer. Again, this is something where you can make them on multiple layers. If you wanted to animate them, they can be on the same thing. You could probably get away with a warp or a puppet tool, I bet you, in After Effects. They're on the same layer in my thing. I kind of, at this point, I was like, okay, it's not that hard to get them further. And then what we're doing here is we're kind of creating almost like a organ pipe like design. You can see I've got like a garden gate. I've decided to cross one over and kind of form those loops there. I'm working on smoothing some of those, and then copying it over using the reflect tool, which is O on your keyboard. I always think about like O, like mirror, like or, but I know that doesn't help everyone. And then a good thing that Illustrator does since I think Illustrator 2015 is that strokes can actually hold a gradient. Now we're going to expand these strokes anyways, but if you wanted to, you could place a gradient on these strokes and it would hold it and keep them as strokes and it would be just fine. But ultimately that's kind of bad building. You don't want strokes in your final build because if you were to load this into an older form of Illustrator, it wouldn't read those. If you had like Illustrator, I don't know, 3 or something, it would go, oh, that's not an object, I can't read it. And then we're applying an effect to it. We're applying an outer glow, just a white one on screen. And I think that looks really good. We're looking at it from afar, and it just gives a little bit of a glow there. I think, okay, let's add another and add another stroke. One thing I would definitely say about this is if you want to get more complex, those yellow gold tendrils could be a completely other light source. And so you'd have to actually place that into your design, or at the very least maybe make a yellow light instead of kind of a white bluish light coming to the right hand side. But under the circumstances, I think having an outer glow is enough, is good enough, because it does provide light and does lighten that front, maybe it's a weak light. It's a bioluminescence, it's not a particularly strong light. And then I think more highlights on those omais would really distract the viewer and pull away from kind of a strong light source we've already set up. And so along with those kind of, let's embrace the anime theme, right? And go with some magic little stars here. Now, I don't usually pick the standard 5-point star. What I tend to do is build kind of like it's a 4-point star, and there's 4 arcs connecting each other, and it's kind of a rounded point. And I've already done a couple of them, so I'm searching for that now, and I have an artboard set up. And this is this digital apothecary logo for Miss Hiss. This is a previous project I worked on. And then these are almost there. I'm kind of tweaking some of the round corner tools here, and then setting these things up in a way that will, work for the overall composition. These little twinkly lights will be coming off the ohm, so I'm copying these over as best as I can. It's kind of ham-handed. I'm doing at this point. I'm like, I've got to finish it today, or I won't at all. And then again, use that mirror. Oh, and then if you actually click the Option key and click on an anchor point on your design, it will use that as the origin for the mirror. And that's how you get that perfect mirror, is that you set up a strong midline for your illustration, and there's an anchor point on almost every object on that midline. Now we're just going to go ahead and steal the same color and appearance that we have in those tendrils to those sparkles, because that's where they're illuminating from. They're coming from those tendrils. That's like the healing magic or whatever. And that's pretty common in anime. You see like speed lines, obviously, these little magic dust, like transformation dust. These would be great for like that kind of magical gold transformation thing. I could see like a cool sorcerer using it at the end of their wand or something like that. You could do a lot more work too. You can make them a little more 3D if you wanted to have some weight to them. And then this is another important thing that a lot of people don't think of, is like, is this creature on the ground? If it is, it should have a shadow. Now, we're not going to do a crazy like dark shadow or work with a bunch of Photoshop layers and do a big diffuse. We're going to just go ahead and do a nice solid ellipse. And I would recommend for that one not using a multiply. And the reason for that is it's probably going to be in your back layer, so it's not going to have anything to multiply against. You're going to want to pick something darker than your background, but not too dark as to be completely black. And the reason it is, if you create a sticker with this, or a t-shirt logo, like a t-shirt design, you're going to want that shadow in the final t-shirt design or in the sticker, but you're going to want it to be an actual solid shape without a feather or something like that. You're going to want that outline. The final outline of this thing needs to be solid, needs to be 100%. Because if you use aliasing in there, or you use fade, or any kind of feather, it's going to bleed. And the printing technique they use at Redbubble is actually an inkjet printer, and so it doesn't handle that really well. If you were going to do, like, let's say, a screen print, well, then you could go ahead and just make a halftone thing there. Anyways, so I'm almost completely done here. I've added another anchor, got my shadow. I'm looking, okay. Last thing to do is you add texture. And this is going to be, you get so much for adding texture here. So I'm going to go ahead and add this paper texture. It's my favorite. I want you to go ahead and visit me at Mike Harris Design if you want to find out more, follow any more of my process, or see any other projects I'm working on. And you can see here I have the final illustration. Looks beautiful. So thanks for watching. Give me a like and a subscribe if you liked what you saw. Have a good night.